Hey, Olga, it's great to finally see you.
Hi, it's good to see you too.
Well, that remains to be seen, but uh, yeah, this is definitely the first time we've ever talked, which is exciting for me because even before you wrote this book, I think I'd read at least a book's worth of your Atlantic articles and loved every one of them.
I know. Yeah, well, thank you so much for reading. Yeah, my book was sort of the culmination of like personal stuff and everything I do for the Atlantic. So I was really excited to be able to write it.
I thoroughly enjoyed reading it and have lots of questions for you. So, I guess the place I want to start is, are you weird?
um, I would say that I am still weird, although people who have talked to me ever since the book came out have questioned that assessment. But yeah, I think there's still, our early childhood experiences shape who we are. So I think I am still weird.
Okay, so tell me what's weird about you.
I am weird because I grew up as a Russian Jewish immigrant in West Texas, and that was a very weird experience. And it's weird to grow up with like zero family friends or house guests or anyone else interacting with you in your life.
I think that's fair, but that's also just situational weirdness, right? It's not an enduring trait that you carry around because if you, let's say, move to New York or DC or Northern California, you would all of a sudden fit right in, right?
Yeah, and that's essentially what happened. I moved to DC and I fit right in. I went to DC for college, and it really, a lot of my weirdness kind of went away because there was a ton of other immigrants in DC, obviously. But I kind of like some of the, those, like, essential feelings that I had growing up, like some of the social anxiety and imposter syndrome that I had from the kind of unusual childhood that I had remained, and so I wanted to explore what it's like to be weird and kind of learn more about that state of being an outsider in a more kind of scientific way.
So when you think about being weird, you think about it more in terms of being a misfit in your context than having just quirky qualities as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I really struggled for with how to define weirdness for this book because there's the research on weirdness, but you're right, it does tend to focus on like the person who was wearing like a red jacket, like instead of the black jacket. But I wanted to kind of focus on something that was more consistent, so I wanted to focus on people who were different from everyone else around them, as opposed to just had a quirky hobby. Because if you think about it, if you have a quirky hobby like riding a unicycle, you could join a club of like unicyclists and suddenly not be weird anymore, and in fact feel very comfortable and like not alienated at all. So I didn't want to pick something that was like just generally thought of as like unique. I wanted to pick something that was more enduring.
Yeah, and in your case, right, you actually had to pick up and move in order to fit in. So not such an easy choice for everyone to make. So
Yeah, yeah.
tell me what was weird about being a Russian Jewish immigrant in West Texas, because I imagine a lot of people can't even imagine that experience.
Right. Well, I actually didn't tell anyone I was Jewish until like high school, because that just wasn't a thing. There weren't any Jews. And everyone was, in fact, an evangelical Christian, and it was sort of taken as a given that you were too. Usually, the first question that Texans ask people, at least in the part where I grew up, is, "What church do you go to?" I became a Christian for a while. Um, yeah, there weren't other really foreigners other than people who were Mexican, just because of the geography. So just a lot of the things my family did, the kind of food that I brought to school, the kind of clothes that we wore, like everything kind of marked us as outsiders. And yeah, that was like a really tough experience at times.
So how did you cope with it?
Mostly I did not. Honestly, I left, and that is how I cope with it. But and that's a real thing that people do to cope with. Obviously, right now we have like a ton of polarization in the U.S. and a lot of sort of right versus left conflict. And some of the people that I interviewed for the book actually were Trump supporters who moved from California to Texas so that they could be more accepted by other Trump supporters. And they felt like, if they were wearing like Trump t-shirts or praying or something like that openly in California, that they wouldn't be accepted. So they actually hooked up with this organization called Conservative Move, which allows people to helps Californians move to Texas so they can be with other Republicans. So it's not it sounds far-fetched, but it's actually now like a business model.
Wow. So that Silicon Valley episode where the manager gets outed for being religious is a real thing.
I have not seen that Silicon Valley episode, but I could imagine that being the case, except in reverse in the case of Texas.
All right, you have to watch it. This is your homework for after the conversation.
Okay.
I want a full weird analysis of what they got right and wrong.
Yeah.
So Olga, tell me, you interviewed some really fascinating people for the book. I would love to hear in particular about an Amish woman that you wrote about.
Yeah. So sorry. So Emma was this Amish woman that I interviewed. She grew up in Missouri in this very conservative Amish group community. I'm sorry. Can we pause for a second? I'm having really severe allergies, and I need to
take your time.
Okay.
I'll be here.
Okay. Sorry.
You must be getting the allergies that we had 2 days ago in Philly.
Okay. Sorry about that.
It's all good.
Yeah. So Emma, this Amish woman that I interviewed, grew up in this really conservative Missouri community, and I don't know. I had always wondered what it was like to if you want to be Amish, you have to so buy in to the idea of being Amish. Like, it is not like a half-hearted thing. Like, you basically are educated through 8th grade, then you stop going to school, and if you're a woman, you have babies with a guy who is like one of 5 boys that you can choose when you're 16 to marry. And
wow.
You basically cook and clean for the rest of your life and babysit. And she looked at that future and she was like, I don't want to do this. It's not just the technology thing. It's not just the farming lifestyle that doesn't appeal. It's like, I don't want my opportunities to be this limited. And she always just felt like this feeling of doubt inside of her. So when she was, I think 16 or 17, she just walked out of her family's farmhouse, and she had smuggled a cell phone, and used it to call this friend of a friend, who basically took her down to Texas, to South Texas, where they happened to live. And she kind of started life all over again, except she was a U.S. citizen who didn't speak English because they speak Pennsylvania Dutch. She didn't understand any social rules or norms. She was completely kind of alienated from the internet, technology, how people interact on a day-to-day basis. She was trying to get educated, so she hadn't gone to high school. So she was trying to get her GED. She was working at the dollar store. And it's it really just goes to show how awful it can be, both to feel like an outsider in your community, but then even when you try to break out of that community and be kind of more free or join a different community, it's still really that period of transition is still really difficult.
Yeah. So what did you learn from her about coping with being an outsider, or going from being an outsider in one context to then living that in another?
Yeah. So what I found from her is that so she really was one of the most difficult stories in the book. She had one of the roughest times. But I found that she really used this strategy of kind of changing the way she thought about being an outsider. It went from being where she was trying to hide that she was Amish or kind of apologize for it, especially among the kind of modern Americans or whatever you want to call them that she was meeting. She kind of reestablished herself. She had to kind of learn to think about her outsiderdom in a new way and in a more positive way, and kind of, so she now is like out, and like she's like a normal 20 something, so she's like dating and like meeting people, and she has to be like, look, like being Amish, having this like extremely traumatic and like difficult thing that I went through made me who I am. It's not the entirety of who I am. You can't make Amish jokes about me because like, that's not cool. But, like I'm now tougher and stronger because I went through this. And once she started kind of asserting herself in that way, things got a little bit better for her than when she was sort of like apologizing for her differences.
So it sounds like then in psychology, we describe that as a combination of reframing and reclaiming.
Yeah.
Is that what she did?
Yeah, it's like a combination of cognitive reappraisal. And then there's also like all this work by, I think it's Dan McAdams and others that talks about life narratives and how this is like the Joan Didion thing with like we tell ourselves stories in order to live. But it's like in a psychological way, which is that, the kinds of stories that you tell about the stuff that's happened to you is what determines how it affects you. And so sometimes all it takes is telling the story a little bit differently to yourself and to other people.
When I think about the McAdams work, Olga, I think about one finding in particular, which is he looked at, if I remember correctly, he basically had people chart their life stories over time on a happiness graph. And there were some people whose life stories just kind of went downward. He called those contamination narratives, and that was obviously bad. And then there was another group of people who had sort of consistently positive, straight line, happy experiences. And then there was a third group that had a much more sort of fluctuating but upward arc. And I thought what was really interesting was the people who had these redemption narratives, where something bad happened, but then it turned good, were actually significantly happier than the people who were just happy all the way along. And I wonder if you saw that dynamic in studying these outsiders.
Yeah, I think, right. Yeah. And I talk a little bit about, I don't know if I go into redemption narratives too much, but yeah, you're totally right. And that is something that I noticed, is that they would inevitably face these challenges because they were doing something unusual and like trying to squeeze into this space that wasn't like naturally designed for them, right? So something like in each of their stories, something bad happened. But then they would, yeah, like kind of like reclaim it and kind of say like, well, but this just like goes to show like how much harder I have to work, and that's like a good thing, or this is going to help me to like make it to the next step, or like this is, and I don't know if most of the people that I talked to were pretty happy. I would say they were also like very self-actualized, like more so than happy. Like they were just very committed to whatever it was they were doing. Probably like more so than other people. Like there wasn't a lot of like, maybe I'll be a race car driver, but maybe I'll do something else. Like it was like, no, this is what I'm doing, and like it provides meaning for my life. So I don't know. I again, it's 36 people, so not like a totally scientific sample, but I did notice a lot of like commitment to their cause in each of the stories.
Okay, I have to ask you, race car driver, you interviewed one of those too. Tell me the story there.
This was one of my favorites because I actually went to go see her race in Canada, and which was not where I thought I would be going. But that actually fits into the interesting thing about female race car drivers, which is it's like very, very hard and expensive to be a NASCAR driver. It's hard for everyone, not just women. I would say that her story was like maybe a little bit more complicated than the like, oh, she faces sexism kind of thing that might be expected. So she does face sexism. People are sexist to her. But kind of more so, it's just like it's like very hard to become a NASCAR driver. Like you have to raise all that money, all the stuff that like the car, the team, the garage, like all that stuff you have to raise money for. So you're basically like, it's like being a politician. You're like fundraising all the time. So she kind of uses her, not like uses in a sketchy way, but just like uses in a smart way, I guess, her outsider status to kind of like build up her brand. So she does a lot of stuff with like women in STEM and like women in technology. She'll like give talks and speeches. She's like more open to doing events and more open to kind of like new forms of fundraising that some of the more like traditional like macho NASCAR drivers might not be open to. And to me, it kind of seems like that's because she's already like such an oddball in this field. Like everyone's already like, oh, a woman, that it's like, okay, well, why wouldn't I like, you know, give a speech about like the importance of asphalt or whatever, you know, because everyone already thinks I'm super strange. Yeah, I mean, that was just like so fast. I just had no idea what goes into being a NASCAR driver, and then to do it when you're like physically smaller and physically different than everyone else in the field is like, it's so crazy. But yeah, she was Julia Landauer. She was a total badass, and unfortunately did not win her race, but it was like a ton of fun to watch and to write about.
So you just touched on something that that reminds me of an interesting dynamic. I'm thinking of some research by Ashley Rosette, who studied what happens when double minorities take leadership roles. And so in one of her studies, she looked at Black women, for example. And let's be clear, in most ways, that's double jeopardy, right? It's even harder, it seems, in the data than belonging to just one minority group. But there was one way that Black women were sort of pleasantly surprised by the fact that people didn't know what stereotypes to apply. And so they got this extra latitude to sometimes sort of act in ways that might be stereotypically male, and other times act in ways that might be stereotypically Black. And they sometimes were able to use that as a resource to maybe gain some flexibility. And it sounds like that's a dynamic you picked up on as well. So how do you think about, I guess I'm curious, for anybody who feels like they don't fit in, how can they take those stereotypes and maybe use them to their advantage?
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's totally something that I picked up on doing this reporting. But I found a different thread of psychology research that kind of applies here, which is that it's once you start breaking rules and defying those stereotypes, like you mentioned, it seems like you're like that kind of opens the door to like a huge amount of creativity and just kind of like living according to your own rules that I definitely picked up on with these people. Like it just seems like so the actual research is that people who are kind of like in an unusual culture or in an unfamiliar environment, or even are just like in a lab experiment, like rejected by their lab director, whatever, researcher, tend to come up with more creative ideas and more unusual kind of solutions to problems. And the quote that I really liked about this from one of the researchers is that like once you see that like things are not functioning according to the rules, you start to kind of break the rules in all these like helpful ways to you. So I don't know. I just found that I was interviewing this one female truck driver, and I don't know. I felt like, so she created this like really popular YouTube series just about like being a female truck driver, and was able to like bring in this like additional income and like build her brand and like connect with other drivers and build this whole community around being a female truck driver. And I think part of that was just because she was like, everyone already like thinks that girls can't drive, and I'm constantly facing these like sexist remarks, and everyone's like stereotyping me. So you know what? Screw it. I'm just gonna have like a YouTube video series where I let people in on my life and like let them follow me around. And I think part of that is just like this freedom of like I can defy all your expectations because I'm already defying some of them. So I thought that was like a pretty cool part of it.
Yeah, I love that. And it's interesting that example also tracks with what you saw in NASCAR, which is it seems like a lot of the latitude, if you're an oddball or a misfit, is for going horizontally as opposed to climbing up vertically. And I guess that makes me think of some of the classic Hollander work on idiosyncrasy credits. The idea that, you know, if you want to deviate from the norms of your group or your field, you often get punished for it unless you've demonstrated a level of performance or contribution or generosity that leads people to say, hey, okay, now we value you so much that we're going to give you extra latitude. Did you find that any of your weirdos that you interviewed were able to earn those idiosyncrasy credits? Did they have to sort of act more normal or try harder to fit in until they'd proven themselves? Or were a lot of them just opting out and saying, you know what, I'm just not going to live the stereotype at all?
Yeah, I talk about idiosyncrasy credits in the book, and one of the people in particular I thought really exemplifies this. She also had a really tough time. So this is a woman named Beverly who is a sociology professor who studies BDSM in the most conservative congressional district in America, which is Wichita Falls, Texas. There's a lot of Texas in the book, which was not intentional, but was helpful when it came to reporting. So she's in Texas. She's in Wichita Falls. She's trying to teach about gender studies in and sociology, and the kids are like quoting Bible verses back to her, and she's saying like, "Oh, feminism. Let's talk about feminism," and they're like, "That's a lie." And so she's like, "Stop," because this is her course work. Like the whole body of literature is something that is kind of anathema to these kids, and so. So what she starts to do is to change the way she teaches the class a little bit. So she kind of starts to like not she doesn't like abandon who she is, but she kind of tries to conform a little bit or meet them kind of halfway before she kind of like throws the full extent of everything at them. So she will start off with like talking about masculinity, or like, hey, do you ever notice that like women wear makeup but men don't? Or like kind of like some gentler topics that are like maybe a little bit easier to handle before you get to like queer theory, you know? And so
I never noticed that. Wait, men don't wear makeup? Newsflash. Right. Okay, now I have to change my worldview.
Mind blown. Yeah, but I thought it was kind of cool how she's like, you know, and she kind of and she faced social struggles too, and so she, you know, kind of she started making a lot of like conservative friends or like really religious friends, and she would just kind of be like, okay, well, I don't necessarily believe everything that you believe, but I'm just gonna kind of, you know, kind of see where we do agree and meet on those points, and then maybe like in a couple years I could tell you about my research about camming and like BDSM and stuff like that, and sexual deviance. And you know, I think that strategy works for her. Like I think that the students have become a lot more receptive. They give her really great feedback. They say that she's really opened their eyes, but I don't think she'd be able to break through to them like that if she was just like, you must agree with me or else, you know.
There's a great literature about that phenomenon on tempered radicalism. By Meyerson and Scully, where they talk about how a lot of times if you unfold your full vision or all of the, you know, all the values or, you know, traits that you possess, people might be a little bit, they might freak out or they might perceive you as too extreme. And so oftentimes what major outsiders will do is they'll conform in small ways and, you know, begin to start making themselves a little bit more vulnerable or self-disclosing a little more, or maybe just doing a bit of extra self-expression, both to warm people up and also see how they react. I'm curious about your observations about the extent to which that makes sense. It's almost like systematic desensitization versus more of a flooding approach where you just put it all on the table and say, hey, this is who I am, take it or leave it.
Yeah, I mean, I think different things are going to work for different people, and different people that I talked to in my book kind of took different approaches. I think part of it depends on like how able you are to kind of do that like blending in and like gradual approach. One person who this kind of had no choice was this male preschool teacher that I interviewed, who was a dude. He's like a big dude with like a beard, like, you know, like he's so there's not really like, he's very happy and friendly and like kid friendly, and there's nothing like super macho or grizzly about him, but there was no way for him to like ease people into the fact that he's male. So I think like, you know, and there's like another person I interviewed who's a doctor with dwarfism, and that was like almost the reverse approach, where people were, especially when he was applying to medical school in the like 80s, it was like a much less enlightened time. People were just automatically like, no, you can't work here, you know, you can't. Yeah, like he was wow. Rejected from I think like 60 different medical schools, just on the basis of the fact that of his height. And he finally, I mean, he made it. He is now a surgeon at Johns Hopkins. But you know, I think what he tried to do is essentially get in the door and then kind of prove himself and show everyone how great he was. yeah, so for him it was like the visible thing about him was the thing keeping him out, and he had to like convince everyone to ignore it.
So you obviously have more latitude when it comes to invisible stigma. I think one of the things that this book did for me, though, was it made me actually start to see being weird as more of an advantage than a disadvantage. And I started thinking about all the ways that being an outsider can give you access to creative ideas and all of the delights of standing out as opposed to fitting in. And then I started getting envious of other people who were weirder than I was. And I was like, wait, okay, so, white male, often not standing out in most environments that I go to. But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I've gravitated toward environments where I do get to be a little bit weird. And that's really helped me develop my novel perspective. So one of the big draws of coming to Wharton, for example, for me was I wanted to be an organizational psychologist in, a school that was traditionally known for finance. And I wanted to be studying altruism in a place that had been stereotyped as the temple of greed. And those contrasts were really helpful in sort of sharpening what distinctive perspective I was bringing to the table. I don't think, though, I would have ever sought that out. And so I'm curious if you could give me the case that you landed at for why I should have been gravitating toward this kind of environment earlier in my career, because I was late to this game.
Well, I'm very glad that you chose to be weird. Yeah, so there are, like I said, a number of advantages that come with weirdness. Creativity is the big one that I saw, which is just this like incredible ability to see things from a different perspective and to come up with creative solutions to problems that there's real life examples like Nabokov, who wrote Lolita while he was in the US. Picasso experimented with cubism while he was in France, I believe, or some other part of Europe that isn't Spain, which is where he's from. And, to lab experiments where people are put in an unusual situation and then they actually thrive and get more creative as a result. So, I mean, for me, like, I think a big part of why I sought out journalism, I mean, partly I think I have this because of my history and my background. I have this ability to kind of see things from a lot of different perspectives because like everything that happens in the news, I sort of like feel like I run it through a filter of like, this is how my Texas friends would see this. This is how my DC friends would see this. And this is what I think the reality is. You know what I mean? Like, which is usually somewhere in between. But so I do think it's helpful to kind of put yourself in environments where you're out of your comfort zone. And in fact, some of these studies recommend, if you're not necessarily like a female NASCAR driver, maybe you could like go study somewhere. Like a big part of the reason why we encourage kids to study abroad in normal times is that it helps open up their perspectives, right? But you could do that as an adult. Like there's nothing unique about being an 18-year-old that means that that's the only time you can study abroad. Like you can go to a different environment and learn from the people there and kind of open up your perspective a little bit.
How much do you think you actually have to immerse yourself in somebody else's world or perspective in order to understand it? I ask in part because there's at least some work suggesting that I think my favorite example of this would be research on fashion designers, where traveling abroad or even living abroad did not predict their creativity. It was working abroad, where they had to understand the culture and incorporate elements of the values and norms into their work in order to be effective there. And that sort of gave them the raw materials then to recombine, different styles. Or I actually don't know a thing about fashion, so I don't even know what they did with that information. But if I did, I would tell you. But, it's interesting to me that a lot of people would stop at just saying, you know what, I'll travel abroad. Or, definitely if I live abroad, that should be enough. And it makes me feel like a lot of what we do to sort of understand worlds that we might be outsiders to is not going far enough. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think most of the studies that I looked at said something about like, it was some horrible scientific jargon like as long as their cultural identities were integrated and not separate, like
yes.
Which
the
like the way like the way I was like, can you say this in normal human speak? And I guess the way they explained it is that you essentially have to be able to like you can't be like, oh, now that I am in France for a week, I'm just going to eat a lot of pastries and then go back to being an American. You kind of have to like integrate some of those French ideas into your daily life, right? So kind of like you were saying with the working versus like just traveling. But another way that this can work without like taking an international vacation is just having like a diversity of viewpoints in your workplace or wherever you're trying to make decisions. Like, so often, and there's like a ton of research on this, as you know, that like having dissenting viewpoints just helps make for better decisions. It helps keep you from going off the cliff of like sunk costs. It helps keep everyone from sinking into groupthink. It just creates those like moments of, wait a minute, should we be doing this or should we be doing something else? So one thing you could do is just hire people who disagree with you and who are willing to kind of pump the brakes and throw up yield signs, for the betterment of your organization.
Yes, please. We need more of those people. I also feel like more yield signs would make people more respectful, which wouldn't be a bad thing.
Right, exactly. Yeah, empathy.
So I also wonder, I'm struck by a few things as I think about what it means to be weird and why that's a good thing in society. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about cross-cultural differences. So, we've talked to Michelle Gelfand in the past on The Next Big Idea, and I know you draw a lot on her work on cultural tightness and loose. Let me try that again. I know you draw a lot on Michelle Gelfand's work on cultural tightness and looseness. And it seems like, in a way, your book is a case for American individualism and its advantages and triumphs. And that, in some ways, we might not want to be as collectivistic as China or Japan. I think your perspective is more nuanced than that, though. And I'd love to hear you articulate it.
Yeah, I don't know that I am. Yeah, I could see why one might think that I that I think that.
By one, do you mean me?
Yeah, yeah, sure. I would not go quite that far though. So yeah, so I do. I do acknowledge in the book that it's easier to be weird in a loose culture than a tight one. Like tight cultures, like just as a recap, are like the Amish and other really conservative religions or really tight-knit cultures. I think Singapore is one that I mention. And then loose cultures, of course, are the opposite. So like Burning Man or, something else where everyone can just do whatever they want with their own art installation. But, okay, so first of all, I say in the book that they both have advantages and disadvantages. I think one thing that you're seeing now, an advantage of tight cultures, is that they're much better at stopping things like pandemics. Like when you have a culture where everyone kind of does their part and everyone is willing to act in coordination, it's much easier to do things like test, trace, and isolate, which is really pretty much the only way to stop COVID. And one reason why we're having so much trouble with that in the US is that we are so individualistic and we're like, well, I'm going to go get my hair cut if I want. And like, people in tighter cultures just don't do that kind of thing if they feel like they're not supposed to. And I would also say that like, it's not so much American individualism. I would say that the best cultures for people who are oddballs are cultures that just are more liberal culturally, so or socially, so not necessarily ones where you can kind of like I wouldn't, I don't know, like some of the most loose nations are like Finland and Sweden and places like that, which I wouldn't necessarily call like individualistic. I just feel like they're a little bit more like live and let live. Or like I think the French term for this is called laïcité, but I don't know. I feel like there's this like certain like everyone's business is their own business that is kind of makes it easier to just have whatever beliefs you have and to like be the way you want to be in a certain country. Yeah, and it has less to do with like I feel like American individualism is often economically tinged as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I like your point that it's more about the conformity expected in a culture than it is about being individualistic or collectivistic.
Yes.
So I want to come back to this point about what if I'm not weird enough? because whenever I do a conversation like this, I want to think of myself as a stand-in for the listener. And so, I think one of your messages is embrace your inner weirdness, right? Don't be afraid of being an outsider. But then if you're mostly an insider, what do you do with that information? And if you're mostly an outsider, let me frame this a little bit differently and say, I think people struggle on both extremes with this problem. Some people feel like they're just too far outside and they can't fit in. Other people feel like they're quintessential insiders and they're not weird enough. And the psychologist Marilyn Brewer, I think, has a great resolution to this paradox when she says, look, we should have optimal distinctiveness. What we want to simultaneously fit in and stand out. And the way that people solve this is they join distinctive groups. And that way they feel a tremendous sense of belonging within the group, but then the group is different from all other groups and therefore they get to distinguish themselves. What's your take on optimal distinctiveness? Is that the answer? Is that what we should all be looking to do, or no?
Yeah, I talk about optimal distinctiveness. I do think that's a great solution, especially for people who are naturally drawn to those groups. I, for a while, tried to make friends with a bunch of other Russians. And that has actually been really helpful. I made friends with a lot of there was like a wave of Russian immigrants who came to the US at the same time as my family. And I befriended a lot of other people from that same cohort. And it's actually been a really great support group for me, just because there's like a lot of stuff about Russian culture that is very distinctive. And I don't know. I wrote this on Twitter the other day, but it's like, if I talk to my American friends about some of the stuff that I talk to my Russian friends about, it would freak them out. It would it's just like too much for Americans. So
What's an example? At the risk of freaking everyone out.
Yeah, just like shit our parents believe or say. Oh, sorry. Am I allowed to swear on this? I'm sorry.
I don't know.
Stuff my parents say about, I don't know, like Russians just aren't woke and like aren't, like they aren't, yeah, I don't know. Just like dealing with our aging parents in a foreign country is like difficult. And so we talk about that a lot. Yeah, and I don't know. So that has actually been really, really nice and like a really good comfort to me. So I wonder if I'm seeking out optimal distinctiveness in that way. And I feel the same way about like other, like, so I live in DC and obviously everyone is like moves here for their job at like a socially conscious like nonprofit. But you still have like groups of like people from Kansas or like people who went to Wake Forest or like people who like you have these like
totally
little subgroups of yeah, like they're it's not that
Demon
weird to
Deacon
be from
what are you doing here?
Like, yeah, so obviously those people are not weird, but it's like for whatever reason people from Kansas feel like a little bit lost in DC and they feel like they need a little sub community to like boost them up sometimes. And actually I get what you're saying where like some people, you know, like might be like lying awake at night thinking like, am I too normal to like reap the benefits of weirdness? But I think that's like maybe a too sunny, I don't think too many people believe that, or at least like, I don't know. I meet so many women that you would think like you're completely normal. You're completely like everyone else. There's absolutely nothing about you that is like less than in any way, but they have like incredible amounts of imposter syndrome and just feelings of like, I don't belong here. And I think that feeling comes from like this internal sense of weirdness rather than like people being like, oh, why do you have like a third eyeball or something like that, you know?
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I've been curious, Olga, about how that plays out now that many of us are working remotely during this pandemic. So I keep seeing this debate that on the one hand, there are people who think, look, virtual communication is a great equalizer. You know, it's harder for one person to dominate the meeting. You can submit comments in a chat window and, you know, the norms just change and everyone has the freedom to express themselves now. And that's easier for women and minorities and introverts. And on the other hand, I've seen lots of arguments and plenty of evidence as well that virtual communication often magnifies those kinds of differences. So, you know, the extroverts are even more likely potentially to dominate the conversation. It may get in some ways harder for women and minorities to speak up. Where have you come down on this? Is it easier to be weird in virtual communication? Is it harder? Is it some of both?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a really interesting question, and I've gone back and forth on this. Like, I feel like at first, when we first all started working from home, it was like, oh, thank goodness, I don't have to go to the office anymore. I don't have to be bombarded with small talk. This is perfect. I'm an introvert. I just want to be inside forever, and that's what I'm going to do. And I think there was that big sigh of relief. Like, I think there is like a lot of intersection between being an introvert and being weird. And I think a lot of people who feel that way did kind of enjoy it at first. I still think though that like I've been in now infinity Zoom meetings, and I think it is a little bit harder than it would seem to still make your voice heard if you're not that kind of stereotypical kind of person who would dominate the meeting anyway. Like, I don't know. I like my company is very like progressive and like understanding and like very like promoting of every like subcategory of person, but it's you still end up having meetings that are dominated by the people they're always dominated by, and even though it's like, oh, like you know, whatever, just type something in Zoom if you want to say something. I feel like it's almost like even harder sometimes because you can't read people's facial expressions as well. And you're also like beaming your living room into like your boss's like computer. I don't know. It's like, it's also like a little bit more intimidating. So I don't know. I feel like this is also new, and I kind of I have a sneaking suspicion that the same people who always succeeded at like office politics are still somehow succeeding even though we're not in the office anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assumption from what I've observed, at least over the last 2 months. I'm really intrigued by something that you just touched on a minute ago when you were talking about the internal versus external perception. So I'm just starting to formulate a 2x2, which always oversimplifies things, but I think sometimes clarifies things too. So on one axis, you have how weird you feel internally. Mm-hmm. The other is how weird other people think you are. And I'm kind of fascinated by the combinations of low high and high low. So there are some people who feel like they fit in, but everyone else thinks they're weird. And I work with someone who fits this description, where whenever he talks, everyone in the room starts to roll their eyes. But he clearly has no idea that he's perceived as not fitting in because he continues to do the same things that were eliciting the eye rolls to begin with. And then on the flip side, we have people who feel weird and think they don't fit in, but are perceived by others as actually belonging. What do you think drives those two combinations, and how do you think about helping people who fit in either category?
Oh, that's so interesting. I think confidence, right? Like I don't know. At least that's what it seems like to me, is that like if you have higher self-esteem, then you're going to think everything you say is like an amazing word of wisdom, and if you have low self-esteem, you're basically like oh man, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't, I have one friend who like was kind of like inspired by my book. She was named like most unique in high school, and she is going to do this thing where she like interviews the other person from her high school who was named most unique, and they're gonna like talk about their lives and like see how being most unique like affected their life trajectories. But yeah, like meeting her, you wouldn't necessarily be like, you're the most unique person I've ever met. Like she's like, she's like a white woman, blogger, like she does like interesting art, but like that's not, I wouldn't say that it is outwardly like very strange. It's like pretty. So I think sometimes it's like almost like an internal feeling, something about you that people pick up on and kind of magnify, and that appears to be what happened to her. And I think for a lot of women, like when you do, I can only speak for women, like when you do face a lot of sexism and prejudice, you start to kind of like internalize it and kind of feel like, well, there must actually be something wrong with me because people treat me like this. And I think that perpetuates a lot of like feelings of imposter syndrome or weirdness or social anxiety, even when it would seem that there's no reason for that to continue.
Yeah, that's fair. So it sounds like in both cases there's a deficit of self-awareness. And one person is not aware of how he or she comes across, the other is not aware enough of his or her own strengths. Um, I wonder if I, I guess what that leaves me wondering is how helpful do you think this kind of feedback is? So you're at some point if somebody tells you you do fit in, we do value you here, or better yet, if they show that through their behavior of welcoming and including you and listening to your expertise, how much of that has to accumulate before it offsets the effects of sexism or prejudice or of being left out for X years of your life?
Oh wow. Right. Like how much yeah, I feel like I don't know because I'm a writer, which is a job where you basically like seek out rejection all the time.
Is that really how
Like
you experience your job, Olga? I hope not.
I feel like it is. I don't know. I feel like it is. No, but yeah, but like it is. Like I wonder if I got into this because I faced so much rejection in my life that I kind of was like I might as well just do the thing with like maximal rejection per minute. But yeah, yeah, so I'm not sure how much has to happen before you feel like you finally fit in. People were very like uh you work for the Atlantic, so you are not like weird anymore. How could you possibly feel weird? But it's like amazing how many like small things happen in a day that like make you feel like you don't really fit in. Like so and I mean, I definitely feel better about my like abilities and my community and my ability to like integrate with other people and to connect with other people than I did a decade ago. But I feel like it's dropped down from like a score of like 9 on the weirdness scale to a score of like 4 or 5. Like, you know what I mean? So I think it's like maybe progressive and gradual. And neuroticism decreases with age. So maybe by the time I'm 60, I will write normal. The how I became normal after a lifetime of weirdness.
That is such a good sequel, and I feel like every author should write the counterpoint to the first book that
Right.
they write or the second book that they write. So it's a good way to avoid being typecast. And being typecast is weird is a really weird way of getting typecast.
Right. Exactly.
So that actually brings me to something else I wanted to ask you about, which is I feel like one of the great feelings of finishing a book is you took on a huge question and you really got to explore it. And one of the great disappointments then of releasing the book is suddenly realizing that there's an important question you couldn't answer, or there's a phenomenon or a theme you overlooked. And so this is still pretty new for you. And I know because of the pandemic, book tour is probably not the same experience it would normally have been. But if you could go back and either add a chapter of the book or rewrite something you already wrote, what would you want to take on now?
Oh, okay. Yes, I have the answer for this. I for various reasons, I did not write a chapter on how to societally decrease prejudice. Like I feel like I wrote about why prejudice exists, like what prejudice does to the people who are being prejudiced against and then or facing the prejudice, and how the people who face the prejudice can like thrive anyway, right? I feel like that's the book is like pretty evenly distributed between those three themes. I did not really write about like how do we stop the prejudice as a society, mostly because I actually looked into that for an article once, and I maybe I'm like out of date with the research now, but I found the research to be so complicated and like not very elucidating and not very uplifting. Like I felt like it was like it's like very difficult to reduce prejudice on a societal level. The only real time that I found that it like happened relatively quickly, and by quickly I mean like decades, was gay marriage. Like we went from like gays are basically like outlaws to like everyone come to my gay wedding in a matter of decades, which is great, but like that really hasn't happened with anything else to my knowledge. Again, I'm like speaking out of turn because this is something I didn't write about. But yeah, so that's something that I'm still like, I'm like so curious about, and people have asked me about, but I feel like I really can't speak to because the research I found wasn't really there, and the answers were like the answers are there, but they will not make you happy, which is that it's just very hard to fight prejudice.
Yeah, no, I think I've had the same reaction, Olga, as a psychologist, feeling like, okay, this is, first of all, it's a sociological or a political science question more than it is a psychology question, and I think you and I both tend to feel most comfortable when we're talking about individuals and groups as opposed to giant policy questions for a whole society, right?
Right.
And also, it seems like, though, part of the way that you're going to tackle the societal prejudice question is through the book, right? So if people read this book, which I know a lot of people have and a lot more will, I think it's a step in the right direction, because to me, a huge part of your impact is leading people to reflect on, okay, not just how am I weird, but also how am I treating the outsiders around me? And could I be doing a better job of supporting them, including them, making them feel heard and appreciated and valued? So I feel like you accomplished what you were setting out to do in a different way by virtue of writing the book.
Thank you. Yes, I meant to do that. No, I appreciate it, and I hope that, I guess it's like the journalist's kind of like thing is like, I hope that by elucidating the problem and like clarifying the problem and the potential solutions, I can help people. But yeah, unfortunately, prejudice is one of those like you said, big topics that people are still going to be grappling with, unfortunately, for a while.
Yeah, I think that's sad but true. So shifting gears a little bit, something else I wanted to ask you about a little bit is, I feel like one of the really interesting questions that this book surfaced for me is, how do we think differently about parenting when it comes to raising kids who might not fit in? And I know you write a lot about what people's upbringings are like and how that may affect whether they feel like they fit in or stand out. But what advice do you have for parents who are maybe discovering that their kid doesn't fit in the classroom, or who might be living in a community where they don't fit in for a variety of reasons? What can and should they do?
So many parents have asked me this since the book has come out, and I'm so glad that they're reading it and thinking about it for their teens and tweens and anyone else at the reading level that it requires. I am going to get in trouble for this because I don't have kids. And anytime I talk about anything to do with child rearing, people yell at me on Twitter. Okay. So this is I'm going to just straight up borrow from the It Gets Better project. Like I feel like the message that I took away was just that all the people that I talked to were like dweebs and freaks and geeks in high school and middle school, and were just like, I don't know, I'm not like everyone else, like what am I gonna do, like I'm a girl who loves trucks, and like I'm just gonna hide that, I guess, until I graduate. and like the answer to the question is just that like after you're done with high school, after you're done with that, like everyone in the same like crucible together, you can really like become who you want. Like you can quit the church that doesn't accept your sexuality. You can, quit the whatever, the marching band if you if you never wanted to do it. Like a lot of people like quit their genders in my book. Like I feel like finding a loose enough culture and one that will accept you for who you actually are is the solution to feeling miserable as a kid. And I don't know how to, as someone who was miserable when they were in middle school and high school, I don't know how to like help that while it's happening, other than just like knowing that it's going to be over soon. I don't know if that's uplifting enough. I'm sorry.
No need to apologize. I think like prejudice, it's a hard problem.
Yeah.
And I think your take is realistic. So it does make me wonder, though, if there are things you'd like to say to teachers or principals or other administrators about, look, a lot of us sort of reach peak discomfort with weirdness in middle school or high school. Is there anything that could be done to try to make that a little better along the way?
Yeah, I mean, so again, this is like a challenge for me because I don't have kids, and the last time I was in high school, it was like a different. The last time I was in high school, when I was in high school, the first and only time, it was a different. It was a different type of time. So we had like we had Phil McGraw's son come to our high school and like do this presentation on like different types of clicks. And it was so just like not enlightened. It was like even to me, a 14-year-old from Texas who had no knowledge of like psychology or anything, I was just like, this can't be good for us. Like it was just like it was like, oh, are you a goth or like a prep? And I don't know. I just feel like kids do not need any help categorizing each other or like deciding what's like good or bad. We had in my high school like a most beautiful and most handsome category for our superlatives for graduation. And it was not like, you know, the kid like with Down syndrome like gets most handsome as like a nice thing. It was like literally like the most beautiful and handsome in the school, and then everyone else is like there's like 3 runners up. Like, I mean, obviously don't do that stuff. That's horrible. And I mean, I will say that my high school has since gotten a lot better, and they had, I think, like an LGBTQ like prom queen a couple years ago, and it made like the Dallas Morning News because it was like a very big deal. So I mean, I think that society is generally moving in a better trajectory, but I think anything you can do that will stop the like relentless categorization of people and exacerbate differences among people is a positive thing.
So this is interesting because I've worked with some psychologists who argue that it's impossible to fight the tendency to categorize, that's just one of the features of the way that our brains work is they recognize patterns and then they start to classify those patterns, and then, you know, applying this to people supposedly had some evolutionary advantages because it could help you avoid a dangerous tribe or, you know, trust the right person. Whether or not that's true, I think remains to be seen. But some of this work is about, instead of running from categorization, actually trying to leverage it for good. So I think of some classic Ellen Langer research, for example, that said, okay, what if we just divided people into smaller categories? And so if you take somebody that you would normally feel prejudice toward or discriminate against, like in her studies, it was people who were physically disabled in some way, and start drawing more distinctions. Notice their eye color. Notice what their hair color is. Start to pay attention to what their voice sounds like. Then they wouldn't belong to this sort of overly amorphous category, and you would start to realize, oh, there are lots of things that make them uniquely human. And the conclusion from that research was, ironically, if we discriminate more, i.e., you know, break down into more detailed parts, then we'll have less prejudice. What do you make of that as a strategy versus the approach that's more about saying we shouldn't categorize, period?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you're right, of course. So I've been watching Normal People.
Don't say
and I
of
read
course.
the book.
I enjoy being wrong.
Sorry. No, I mean, like the idea that like we can find ways to categorize people even when it's not a like unwoke Texas high school and things seem relatively standardized. So like Normal People, they're all, to me, everyone in that show looks the same. They're all in Ireland. They wear school uniforms. They all look pale and like have accents, and yet the school is apparently rife with like class distinctions that are like ruins the lives of multiple characters because they're like, you're just a lowly maid's son. Like, it's, you know, and I'm like, how did you figure that out? But yeah, it's, you know, so it's true. Like you can categorize anything. I am not familiar with the research that you mentioned. I think that could work. I think that also that could have people, that seems like one of those things that people could try and kind of like misfire, and it could get even worse. One thing that I think might apply is Michelle Dugood's research on the upside of political correctness, which is interesting because it's basically like suggesting that because so many underrepresented groups do face prejudice in social situations, the way to get around that is just to try to be really politically correct and like polite and like maybe overcompensate for how like genteel you would normally be in a situation, because that'll make everyone feel more welcome and actually improve the performance of the whole group in a work context. And I don't know, I think that could work. Like I think like if you know, if you just try to like, yeah, I mean maybe that's like the case for like business professionalism speak, is like, hey, at least it makes everyone feel comfortable, you know.
I found that work so counterintuitive. This is the work Michelle did with Jenny Chapman, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I first read that research, it was the exact opposite of what I would have expected, because when I think about creating psychological safety, the whole idea is that we want to make it easier for people to take risks, and we want them to be more comfortable saying the things that they would normally suppress. And so I thought that political correctness was the enemy of psychological safety. And yet it seems like, at least against this backdrop of people feeling like they're constantly stereotyped or they're regularly targets of prejudice, knowing that everyone else in the room is going to take care to be respectful is a way to make them comfortable speaking up. Does that mean you would actually advocate for more political correctness in workplaces and schools?
I actually don't think there's anything wrong with political correctness. Like, I feel like I'm not politically correct has become like this weird like rallying cry of like, I'm not respectful to how other people feel. Like, I don't know. I mean, I guess people mean it in different ways, and sometimes it just means like, I'm a real talk person. But I think that like, to the extent that you can acknowledge that people are coming from different backgrounds and are struggling with different things and might be bringing different conditions to a situation, like, and take that into account when you're talking, I think that's a good thing. So again, I will respond to your study with an anecdote. I for the book, I use this service called Joyable, which is like a social anxiety app, and the counselor that came with it would do this thing where like every time she asked me a question, she'd be like, would it be okay if I suggest something? And like, would it be okay if I offered a tip to you right now? And I was like, why does she keep asking me if it's okay? And I realized that she was trying to create that feeling of psychological safety, that like I'm ultimately in control of the situation, and that like if something isn't okay with me, I should feel free to say it at any time. And like, it was complete overkill. Like I was not so psychologically fragile that I needed her to keep asking me if it was okay. But I was like, you know what? This is like a really nice thing. Like she's trying to make me feel good about using this service and feeling like I'm, you know, in control here. And I think we could all do more of that. I don't know.
Is it okay if I laugh at your anecdote?
Yes, please.
I already did, so we're all good here. So Olga, is it okay if I ask you lightning round questions?
Yes.
Okay, good. Well, I was probably going to try to do it anyway, but if you didn't want to, we don't have to. So, all right, first question is, what's the weirdest thing about you that you haven't already covered?
I don't like the band Radiohead.
Is that weird?
I feel like everyone likes them, and every time I say that, everyone gets mad at me, so I think so.
Fair enough. All right. What's a weird quality that you admire in other people and wish you had more of?
Actually, introversion, because I think it makes them better listeners.
I'm sorry, what were you saying?
I said introversion
because
I think it makes people... Oh.
Sorry, I couldn't resist. Need to work on my listening skills, clearly. Okay. Introversion. You're not an introvert?
No, I would say I'm an extrovert.
Good to know. I thought you had identified with introversion earlier, so I wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I don't know. I every time I take the test, it puts me on the middle line, so I just like pick a different one every time.
You might be an ambivert then.
Yeah, possibly. I don't know.
All right. Next lightning question is, when you think about fitting in, what is the moment in your life where you most felt like you belonged?
When I was in college, living in an apartment with my 3 best friends.
All right. So not everything gets better with age. That one peaked in college.
Well, now I just live in an apartment with my boyfriend, who's kind of my best friend, but my actual best friends are cooler. So
You should definitely play this part for him. Maybe it'll up his coolness factor.
Yeah, totally.
This is the motivation he needs. Okay. And then when you think about the different places you've traveled, is there somewhere that you think is especially accepting or welcoming of weirdness?
Yeah, I always feel like, so maybe this is like ethnocentrism because I'm Finnish, but I always felt like Scandinavia is very like just do whatever and like let your freak flag fly type place. Yeah.
Any particular city, town?
I felt that way about Oslo. It just seemed like a very like radical punk rock gilded city.
Even when you're in the Nobel Prize hall or the former Nobel Prize hall, right? People can wear whatever they want.
Yeah,
Amazing.
I just felt like, yeah, I don't know.
And then my personal favorite question to ask in a lightning round: what's the worst career advice you've ever gotten?
Only write a book about a topic that you are passionate about, because I hate the word passionate as applied to advice given to women. Sorry.
Why?
Because I think it makes women afraid to take things on, because I think that we have such a high, we imbue the word passion with so much import and meaning that it basically disqualifies everything other than like your own child.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so I have two quick follow-ups on that. One is I hate when women apologize for things that they shouldn't be apologizing for. And you said sorry for the passion comment. Why did you apologize for that?
Oh, I apologize all the time. I find that it helps sources feel more comfortable with me.
Am I a source?
No, but it's just a force of habit at this point.
Got it. And I trust you've seen the Alison Woodbrook's research on how superfluous apologies lead you to come across as warmer, right?
Yes. Yeah, that's basically why.
Got it. Okay. I think that should not be necessary, but that is a separate conversation. Okay. And then the other follow-up is, okay, if you shouldn't worry about writing a book about something you're passionate about, then what should you follow instead? Is it curiosity?
Yeah, I would say something that you are just wrestling with and that you really want to explore. If you're a writer, I mean, that's enough of that's like what passion is for writers, right? It's curiosity. I don't know.
I think so. Although, there is part of me that wants to just push back slightly on one element of this, which is a book follows you for a very long time. And you sort of get stuck talking about the same topic for 8 or 10 years, even if you only intended to spend a couple of years on it. And so I've raised my bar over time around, do I care enough about this topic? Do I find it interesting and important enough to want to write a whole book about it? But it doesn't sound like you're disagreeing with that. You're just saying the word passion itself sort of evokes an impossible standard.
Yeah, I don't know. I also don't think that people say that to men. Like, I don't think people are like, are you passionate about the Civil War? Like, I feel like it's...
No,
like,
I've never been asked that question, just for the record.
I think it's like the dude just wants to write a Civil War book. And, like, I feel like that should be an acceptable standard. Like, I just don't... I don't know. I feel like I got so wigged out in the early parts of this about, like, passion and, like, I don't know. It's more confusing to me than clarifying.
Oh, that's such an interesting observation. I would love to see some research on this, because I think you're right. I think people expect women to be passionate, whereas men are allowed to write about or be interested in just about anything.
Right. I don't know. It's like whatever you're interested in. I don't know. It's a work
Yet
project.
another double standard. Add it to the list. It's too many pages to print. Well, Olga, this has been really enlightening and also entertaining. Thank you for taking the time to do it. Is it okay if we close now?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much. And yeah, this was super fun.
Thanks for writing it. I hope everyone reads and enjoys Weird.